Good evening and welcome to Scotland at 7. My name is Saoirse Healey. Tonight I'm joined in the studio by Martyn Day, the MP for Linlithgow and East Falkirk. Martyn, how are you this evening?
I'm great, thank you very much.
It's a pleasure to have you on the show, and so we'll move straight on to our first story. As always, it's the Ukraine war update. It's day 582. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg, on an unannounced visit to Kyiv, said Ukrainian forces were gradually gaining ground in their counteroffensive against Russian forces. Speaking at a joint press conference with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, Stoltenberg said, "Every meter that Ukraine forces regain is a meter that Russia loses." Stoltenberg announced that NATO has framework contracts in place for 2.4 billion euros of key ammunition for Ukraine, including 1 billion euros in firm orders. Russia is set to hike defense spending by almost 70% in 2024, according to its finance ministry. Russia has continued to increase funding for arms manufacturing and its military despite persistently high inflation and the weakened ruble. Ukraine's Air Force said today that its air defense systems had shot down 34 out of 44 Shahed drones that Russia launched overnight. Odessa Regional Governor Oleg Kipper said his region was the main target, but the attack left no casualties. There were also strikes on Kirovad Oblast in Mykolaiv. One man was killed and another was injured in Kherson overnight. 3 people have been hospitalized after a strike on Antonovka. UK Defence Secretary Grant Shapps met with President Zelensky in Kyiv today to discuss how to bolster Ukraine's air defences. The visit was Shapps' first trip to Kyiv since he became Defence Secretary last month. In a critical dossier, Greenpeace has said that the International Atomic Energy Agency is unable to properly monitor the safety at the Russian-occupied Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. The report said that the IAEA has too few inspectors and faces too many restrictions on their access. Ukrainian Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba said the grain exports between Kyiv and Warsaw was detrimental to both countries. Russian President Vladimir Putin has signed a decree making the 30th of September officially recognized as a day of reunification for the 4 regions that Russia claimed to annex from Ukraine last year. Aid money for Ukraine has become a bargaining chip for US congressional Republicans as lawmakers negotiate on a bill to extend government funding beyond the end of the month and avoid a government shutdown. Iranian kamikaze drones used in the latest attacks on Ukrainian cities are filled with European components, according to a secret document sent by Kyiv to its Western allies. Some mercenaries of the Russian Wagner Group have left Belarus to return to the front in Donetsk Oblast, according to Ilya Yevlash, a Ukrainian military spokesperson. Bulgaria's parliament on Wednesday decided to send aging Soviet-era S-300 surface-to-air missile systems to Ukraine, its first such shipment to Kyiv. At least 3 pro-war Russian journalists were sent severed pig's head over the past week, including the state media columnist Timothy Sergeytsev, who last year published an article calling for the murder of Ukrainian civilians. So, Martyn, there's obviously a lot to unpack in that update. One of the first things I'd like to ask you about is the Putin's day of reunification. Do you think that this is a more calculated soft power move, or is this just another one of his slightly left of field policies when it comes to Ukraine?
I certainly can't predict what Putin's doing or what his motivation is. I didn't expect the war to happen in the form it has. I thought his whole bid at the very beginning was simply to annex those Russian-speaking areas. So I was surprised at how things unfolded. So who knows is basically what I'm saying. I just think very unstable situation that just doesn't seem to be getting any closer to a resolution. Very concerning.
And do you think that this war will end via diplomacy or military strength? Obviously, there's a little bit of ground gaining from Ukraine, but how important do you think the role of diplomacy will play out in the peace talks?
I mean, ultimately, everything does come down to diplomacy for getting any kind of lasting resolution. I don't think necessarily that Putin is somebody that can be easily negotiated with, and that is unfortunately going to, I think, require more of the military effort on the ground to get to the point where a negotiation becomes the best outcome for him. So, not a great position.
And do you think that if Putin were to no longer be the president, do you think that has the potential to increase the speed of the peace talks?
It would certainly allow a different leader to perhaps create or enter peace talks without losing face. Whereas I think Putin would lose too much face and too much necessary influence in his own country if he did that. So I think that's the difficult position that we're in. Until he goes, it's less likely that we'll have a peace unless it's forced peace.
Mm-hmm. So we will move on to our next story. Audit Scotland has said that the Scottish Government no longer expects to have enough money to deliver all its planned £26 billion investment in public sector infrastructure. Growing the economy and delivering high-quality public services relies on infrastructure like roads, railways, hospitals, and other buildings. But a combination of reduced capital budgets, higher costs, and increased maintenance requirements have left ministers with difficult decisions to make on prioritising capital spending. This includes stopping or pausing planned projects. The Scottish Government investment plan focuses on driving inclusive economic growth, enabling the transition to net zero emissions, and building resilient and sustainable places. But it is not always clear how the Scottish Government will be able to direct funding to these three infrastructure investment priorities. The report called for better data on the condition, occupancy, and cost of the wider public estate is needed to ensure buildings are used more efficiently as part of the Scottish Government plans to reform public services. The Scottish Government anticipates a 7% real terms reduction in the capital block grant it receives from the UK Government between 2023 to 24 and 27 to 28. It expects its capital budget to be significantly less than it anticipated in 2022. Construction cost increases have affected existing public estate projects. By June 2023, out of the 45 projects, the cost of 8 had been increased, 13 had been delayed, and a further 3 had been paused. Overall, the cost increase between December 22 and June 23 for these projects and programmes is expected to be at least £55 million. See Exhibit 5 in the report for details of the individual projects. A revised infrastructure investment plan project list is expected alongside the 24 to 24 budget. The Scottish Government has begun a coordinated approach to reform how offices and other administrative buildings are used. Individual public bodies are responsible for managing their operational buildings, such as hospitals and colleges, more efficiently. 22 private finance initiative contracts worth £900 million will return to public ownership before 2030. However, there are risks associated with PFI contracts ending, and public bodies need to consider the impact of contracts ending on the future budgets, how they will provide services, and how the wider asset management strategies. So, Martyn, there's obviously a lot of jargon in that section. So would you be able to break down the financial impact that inflation is going to have on these infrastructure projects?
Well, I think first thing that's worth saying, it's not a great position to find ourselves in, and it would be probably a better place for one of my colleagues in the Scottish Parliament to explain how they will tackle the situation that they're now faced with. However, what's, from my point of view, worth pointing out is the fact that any country in the world faced with increased costs has to make difficult decisions, and that's just a global phenomenon. But every other nation in the world isn't subject to another country cutting its block grant budget, which is effectively what's the real cause of this problem is. It certainly compounds the problem. If that 7% cut from the UK means that really tough decisions are going to have to be made here. Now, when they were given estimated figures back in 2022, plans were made based on what appeared to be coming from the UK. Now, any independent country would not find its plans derailed like this. So that is a message I think that I and my colleagues need to get out to the Scottish public. And then we have to tackle, well, what projects get put on hold or delayed, because that's the reality of this financial position.
And how... So you mentioned about how it's different for a Scottish MP rather than an MSP. What is it that the SNP in Westminster are able to do to try and assist these infrastructure projects, or is it more you have to allow Holyrood to take the majority of that?
Well, in terms of the decisions on which projects get delayed as a result of the lack of funding, then that is undoubtedly the decisions that Holyrood will have to make. At Westminster, we have a different battle to fight, and that is the fight over that sort of reduction of 7% to the capital grant, because that is clearly unacceptable. To let Scotland and the devolved nations believe they're getting a certain amount of funding and then decide a few years down the line to cut that. And then for plans are not made overnight, plans are made for years in advance, and there should be a structured approach to how you deliver them. And that is clearly unmanageable if you're operating with one hand tied behind your back and someone else pulling the plug on parts of your finance. So I think we've got good grounds to be arguing with them as we go back. There'll be perhaps opportunities in the King's speech and the autumn financial statement, and certainly in the budget in March. So that's got to be our battleground. Scotland needs a better deal. It needs at the very least the deal we were promised. It needs a better deal than that, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm. And so we will move on to our next story. Staying with the Conservatives, in a series of radio interviews today, Rishi Sunak refused more than a dozen times to provide clarity over HS2's future. However, he insisted that scrapping the Birmingham to Manchester leg would not be a betrayal of the north of England. After 2 weeks of speculation and uncertainty over the remainder of the project, the Prime Minister refused to say whether HS2 would be pared back. Sunak is understood to have raised significant concerns about HS2's costs, but faced a barrage of lobbying from Tory former Prime Ministers and Chancellors to push ahead with the plan and level up the country and deliver improvements to rail capacity. Asked by BBC Radio Manchester's Anna Jameson if the north leg of HS2 could be axed, Sunak said, I'm not speculating on future things. He then told her that the vast majority of the journeys that people make are in cars. Another attempt made by Sunak to deflect from the future of HS2 was to say there were already spades in the ground for the first phase, connecting Birmingham to London. However, he offered no certainty about the future of phase 2, which would connect Manchester and Birmingham via Crewe. I know there's a lot of speculation on this, said Sunak. It's always right that the government is looking at things to make sure we are doing things in a way that creates value for money. He said the government was focused on improving other transport issues such as potholes and local bus routes in rural areas. Sunak denied that the future of the Northern Powerhouse Rail, the NPR, would be affected. The NPR project was designed to improve east-to-west connections across the Pennines, speeding up rail journeys between Liverpool, Manchester and Leeds. Supporters of NPR fear that curtailing HS2 could have a bigger impact because the NPR will rely on a section of HS2 from Manchester Airport to Manchester Piccadilly and benefit from upgrades to Manchester Piccadilly Station. Sunak's unequivocating threatens to deepen the row among senior Tories over HS2's future, with supporters and critics piling pressure on the Prime Minister to make a decision. Plans for HS2 to be extended to Scotland were never seriously pursued by the UK government. So, Martyn, HS2, What's your first thoughts on Sunak trying to avoid the questions?
Well, I'm not surprised he's trying to avoid the questions. He certainly won't want to tell anyone publicly that he's ditching the Manchester part until after his party's had its conference in Manchester in a week or 2 weeks' time. So I suspect he'll keep trying to dodge that for a bit longer. But the reality is it doesn't come anywhere near Scotland. It's not going to really benefit anyone from the north of England and ourselves in terms of quicker journey times, and it's not even going all the way into Euston. All that's certainly happening is the costs are going up. I mean, this was a project that was 30 odd billion to begin with. It was 100 billion in 2019, and now they're estimating it could be as much as 180 billion. It's just a big black hole that's not really fulfilling the linkages that this island needs in terms of economic development and growth.
So do you think that should it reach completion, do you think that it will pay for itself, or do you think that this kind of money black hole that you're talking about, do you think that it will just continue to suck money out of the budget?
We've not heard the end of the story yet, so who knows what it will reach by the end of the day. But we're looking at what the 2040s before it's completed in whatever form. So we're a long way away from the end game yet. So yeah, it's not a very satisfactory public procurement project. It's the biggest public procurement project I believe in UK history, and it's certainly just spiralling out of control.
And what do you think could happen to the project should Labour take power in the next election?
Well, I'm not quite sure what will happen there. I mean, I believe the project was originally a Labour idea. It was then taken on by the Tory and Liberal coalition, and it's been adjusted and tweaked here and there, which is partly the reason why costs are going up. Who knows what the next set of changes will be, or whether it just gets the plug pulled? Who can say? Who can say?
I guess only time will tell on that one.
Indeed.
So our next story of the night. The Scottish and Welsh governments have written to the UK government calling for a new Four Nations summit on reaching net zero, to be chaired by an independent climate change committee. The call follows the Prime Minister's speech on climate change last week. The letter, co-signed by Scotland's Net Zero Secretary Martyn and Wales Minister for Climate Change Julie James, highlights the weakness of current arrangements for working with devolved nations and calls for greater UK collaboration in agreeing the pathways towards the UK's legally binding net zero targets. The two governments propose that the summit be chaired by an independent climate change committee, which acts as a statutory advisor to all four nations. In this letter, Martyn and Julie James expressed their disappointment at the Prime Minister's statement announcing that the UK government is significantly changing course on key net zero commitments. They say that despite the far-reaching implications of the announcement made, the substantial changes in policy that will impact progress in delivering net zero have profoundly negative impacts for the environment and the economy across the UK. There was no prior engagement with the devolved government. Given the delivery of the climate ambitions of the four nations of the UK are intrinsically linked, they say that this was deeply unsatisfactory. The letter also goes on to point that the UK government has not provided a level of detail required by such significant announcements. Ms McCallan and Ms James said that tackling the twin crises of climate change and nature loss is one of the most significant challenges facing people and the planet this century, and all nations of the UK must work in partnership to complete the net zero journey. They say delivering progress on net zero requires urgent action and higher ambition from the UK government to issues reserved to Westminster to complement the actions taken under devolved powers. The letter urges the UK government to establish a new, mutually respectful partnership with the aim of developing an agreed four-nation approach to net zero in a collaborative manner, and invite Michael Gove to commit to a high-level summit for a four-nations approach, and to agree that the statutory advisors, the Independent Climate Change Committee, may be invited to chair the summit. So, Martyn, what's your thoughts on the potential for this summit? Do you think that first off the bat, do you think that the UK government will go for this? Do you think that it will happen?
Well, I don't know what their outcome will be. It would be sensible, I think, for them to agree to that. I think Sunak's in a hole in the environment, and he probably needs a bit of cover to get out of it, and hopefully the devolved nations can help with that, actually, because it's in all of our interests to get the environment right. So we do need some sort of sane position coming out of Westminster. The whole issue, though, highlights, the complete democratic deficit that we face in the UK. The fact that Sunak made this major announcement, he didn't announce it to Parliament. He waited until the day after Parliament had risen for the conference recess, so there was no democratic scrutiny of the statement, and he didn't even have the courtesy to foretell the devolved nations what was going to be in that statement. Well, it just sort of, it stinks, basically. So, we do need to get a completely different model, and I think the very constructive suggestion being made by the devolved governments is genuinely helpful, and I hope that he responds to it in the manner in which it's been offered.
And how important is it for the Westminster government to recognise how key all of the devolved nations are in tackling climate change?
It's absolutely key. I mean, the nations are, inextricably linked in terms of what we do will impact on one another. And also the level of powers that we have, that means that no one nation is in control of everything that they need to be to tackle climate change on their own. I mean, for example, we have environmental powers, we have control over heat, but we don't have control over energy. So how on earth can you really logistically do that without control over all of these policy areas? So it's essential that we do get the governments to work together. And, I think it also highlights why we need the full powers of independence, so we can just act in our own interest and make sure that we are not a net contributor towards global warming and help being part of the solution.
And obviously, with Rishi Sunak's reverse, his backslide on eco policies, how important do you think it is to keep up, pushing for pro-environmental policies in Scotland when in England they are being rolled back? I mean, outside of politics, like what can individuals do?
Well, I think we do all just need to constantly keep the pressure on. I mean, it's I'm reminded of the old expression, if you're not sure what the big picture is, concentrate on the small one, because at the end of the day, the big picture is made up of all the little pictures. So each of us can make a difference by being much more positive about how we treat the environment, doing things that are less damaging, and we need our local authorities, our own government here in Scotland, doing what they can, and we need to put pressure on Westminster to play ball and do more that it can do. And I've spoken to a number of businesses in my own constituency which were gearing up towards different targets. They find this whole uncertainty of what's been announced by Sunak very unhelpful. And I think we've got to remember that a proper just transition, which is what we all want, is about maintaining jobs as well as saving the planet and making sure that we all have a sustainable future. And I think instead of helping, Sunak's just pushed that back.
Mm-hmm. Couldn't agree with you more on that one. So our next story of the night, Labour has U-turned on its previous policy to remove private schools' charity status. Private schools are now going to retain some of their tax breaks under a Labour government after the party U-turn on its pledge to strip them of their charitable status. The party is reported to have justified the announcement by claiming that it no longer needs to end the charitable status of private schools to achieve its policy of charging 20% VAT on fees and ending business rates relief in England. Independent schools are able to claim gift aid on donations and avoid paying tax on annual profits, which must be reinvested in education. The latest move contradicts comments made in 2021 by Rachel Reeves, the Shadow Chancellor. Reeves said at the time, "Here's the truth, private schools are not charities, and so we will end the exemption and put that money straight into our state schools. That is what a Labour government will do." Party sources are now claiming that they only ever intended to remove the VAT and business rate perks, saying charitable status was used more as a shorthand for the policy. So, just to pick up on that last bit, charitable status was used as a shorthand for the policy. Do you think that what do you make of that little section?
Well, it's not how I would have interpreted their comments. It's probably not how the general public would interpret the comments either, and it's just generally disappointing. But it's I have to say, sadly, it's not surprising. We've just heard so many reversals from official Labour policy or Keir Starmer's own leadership bid policies that they bear no relation to the policies that we've been hearing over previous years. So what is the purpose of Labour and what do they actually stand for? I was starting to draft up material for my next sort of set of local leaflets, and I thought I could put a few of the Labour reversals in, and I've realised I'd be saying more about what they've changed policy on than what I'm wanting to say about it. The catalogue is enormous, and this one, is relatively minor compared to some of the things like abandoning what they'd said previously about the two-child cap or the rolling back on their green pledges or their energy company plans. Or I mean, where do you start on your favourite Labour reversal, the taxing the higher income rate higher, or abolishing the House of Lords? I mean, the list just seems to be absolutely endless, and I'm sure the viewers are probably shouting at the screen, listing another half dozen that I've not mentioned in that very quick summary there. It's just breathtaking for all
Yeah,
the wrong
it
reasons.
really is. And so, do you think that all of these U turns, how do you think that that's going to impact the trust that the electorate has in Labour?
I don't think it's going to help them any, and it just seems very bizarre to me, given if you look at the opinion polls, the Tories are at the worst edge that I've seen, certainly in my politically active lifetime. They could actually be saying things that they really wanted to do and believed in, and setting an agenda that could inspire people. Instead, what we're getting is very much, it's not even Tory light, it's very much Tory same. I think they've just missed a marvellous opportunity, and I feel very sorry for the state of British politics. I'm just glad that in Scotland we have alternatives.
And how important do you think Keir Starmer is to this new, like you were saying, Tory-esque Labour Party? Do you think that he, personality-wise, lays at the core for this kind of shift in Labour?
I think undoubtedly that's the case. Jeremy Corbyn had his faults, but he was a thoroughly principled individual, and you knew what he stood for. Starmer is more perhaps media savvy, but no one knows what he stands for. So, I mean, how does that square with voters deciding who they place their trust in? They may decide they don't want the Tories, but what is the alternatives? Well, thankfully in Scotland we have other alternatives, but I do feel very sorry for my friends in England.
Yeah, me too. So, our next story. The IPSO has ruled Suella Braverman's claims about ethnicity of grooming gangs was false. Braverman claimed that child grooming gangs in the UK were almost all British Pakistani in a Mail on Sunday article published in April. In this article, the Home Secretary singled out British Pakistani men as being involved in child sex abuse due to cultural attitudes completely incompatible with British values that have been left mostly unchallenged both within their communities and the wider society. IPSO has forced the Mail on Sunday to issue an apology and correction to Braverman's piece after concluding the statement was false. The regulator said Braverman's decision to link the identified ethnic group and a particular form of offending was significantly misleading, because the Home Office's own research had concluded offenders were mainly from white backgrounds. In its defence, the Mail on Sunday argued that prior to publication, it had double-checked Braverman's decision to single out British Pakistanis with advisors to the Home Secretary and the Prime Minister Rishi Sunak. Both teams at the top level of government confirmed they had no concern over this particular line and were happy for it to be published. The newspaper also unsuccessfully argued it was entitled to rely on information provided by the Home Secretary about the ethnicity of grooming gangs, because the Home Office was the department responsible for dealing with the issue, and Braverman, as the most senior member of the department, should have known her facts. The regulator concluded that regardless of the discussions that had gone on behind the scenes, the Mail on Sunday had published an inaccurate statement as fact. This led to the highly unusual situation of a newspaper printing a factual correction to a comment article authored by a leading cabinet minister. Suella Braverman has also come in for criticism within her own party following her speech to a right-wing think tank in America called the Reform of the UN Refugee Convention and Human Rights Laws to tackle what she described as the existential challenge posed by illegal migration. So, Martyn, the top-level government officials said that they found no issue with Suella Braverman's statements. What does this tell voters about top-level government officials?
Well, I do wonder what they were thinking, but I'm a bit more certain of what I think Braverman was thinking. I've said before, I mean, she is a thoroughly horrible, extreme right-wing politician. I use the term, and I don't use it lightly. I believe she's a fascist. And, she's just stoking up the politics of hate. She's othering a different community, and she's using it as a sort of red meat bait to try and save votes for the Tories in the most base and horrible manner possible. There should be no truck with that style of politics in our country whatsoever. And I've no doubt that she knew what the facts were. I just don't believe that she's made a statement in error, which she's now had to apologise for. I think she was quite intentional in what she said and did.
And how much onus do you think lies with the Mail on Sunday, because they are obviously quite a right-wing publication?
They all play into this culture war agenda that they're all onto, and we need to be clear on it that we are not interested in playing culture wars. It's just a very divisive, negative approach. We need to be looking at how we lift people out of poverty and actually benefit our society and bring people together. That is absolutely essential.
And would you say that this is calculated coming up to the elections, this culture war?
Absolutely. I mean, I think the Tories are on their uppers, and they deserve to get trouncely beaten in every part of the United Kingdom, and I'm confident that they will in many parts of it. But they're now trying to salvage any kind of vote they can, and they're playing for the most base right-wing fascist voter, and they're playing for people that maybe otherwise would not be engaged and should not be engaged with. It's quite despicable.
And so how can left-wing parties like the SNP, how can you combat this culture war that the Tories are stoking up? What can be done when your opponents are taking the lowest of the low road?
I mean, there are a number of things that need to be done. We need to all be conscious of speaking truth to power. We need to be welcoming and embracing of all parts of our society and not othering people. When you hear somebody othering people, they're usually trying to hide something else rather than attributing the blame. Here we have a situation of grooming gangs. I mean, any sane person would be critical of the groomers. It doesn't matter what their background or ethnicity is, that it's the issue of grooming. A completely despicable group that probably almost every sane person of any political view could unite to be opposed to. And yet we have the Home Secretary, one of the highest offices in the UK, othering British Pakistanis and using them as a scapegoat when the evidence was that clearly they were a minority of the groomers. The groomers were mainly white. Shocking, so we all have to be prepared to call out the nonsense and, not blame our favourite villains, whatever they happen to be. And there's just no excuse for it. And when it comes to the ballot box, the message should be clear. If you don't have a Tory MP at the moment, vote for that person. And if you do have a Tory MP, vote for the best second place candidate and give them a good drubbing because they deserve it.
Mm-hmm. And to talk about Suella Braverman's giving speeches to right-wing American think tanks, what's your stance on sitting ministers, sitting high-level politicians going and giving paid-for talks on big issues of policy like refugee policy and human rights?
I think politicians have an obligation to say what they think and believe on opportunities, but I would certainly be opposed to anyone in ministerial office taking a paid speaking gig. I mean, I just think that is reprehensible, leaving aside the contents which are probably make it even worse. It's just not something that should be allowed. We should all be entering politics to do the best for our communities, not to find extra revenue in a paid gig here and there, especially one that's basically preaching vile hate messages, in my opinion.
Yeah. So our next story, the BBC has updated its social media guidelines to include a strengthened Lineker clause in an attempt to stop high-profile presenters expressing strong views on party politics. Earlier this year, Gary Lineker refused to apologise for tweets about the language used by the Home Secretary Suella Braverman to describe asylum seekers. Lineker was suspended by the BBC Director General Tim Davie, only to be reinstated after a staff rebellion. Although the BBC has strict rules governing the use of social media by employees in its news division, the rules for other staff members were previously more relaxed. After an extensive review lasting most of the year, the BBC has now created a third category, which snares Lineker and a number of other freelance presenters who work on BBC flagship programmes. Full list of BBC programmes and the presenters affected by the new rules are Fiona Bruce from the Antiques Roadshow, The Apprentice's Lord Sugar, Dragon Den's Evan Davies, The One Show's Alex Jones, presenters of major events such as sporting events, Master Chefs John Turode and Greg Wallace, Gary Lineker and Mark Chapman from Match of the Day, Tess Daly and Claudia Winkleman from Strictly Come Dancing, all of Top Gear's current presenters, Radio 1's Greg James, Zoe Ball, Vernon Kay and Scott Mills from Radio 2. These presenters will be banned from endorsing or criticising a political party, criticising the character of individual politicians in the UK, commenting on any issue that is a matter of political debate during an election period, and taking up an official role assisting or fundraising for campaign groups. They will also have to stay quiet on party politics for a 2-week period before and after the series has been broadcast. Fiona Bruce's inclusion on this list has raised some eyebrows, since she is the presenter of the BBC's Question Time programme, which has regularly been subject to the allegations of political bias. Miss Bruce would have been expected to already be included in the news category. So, Martyn, what are your thoughts on this? Because obviously the BBC ostensibly is a public service broadcaster and it is meant to be apolitical. So what are your thoughts on these freelance presenters now being enforced to be apolitical?
Well, I received the email this morning from the BBC telling me about these new procedures, so I had a quick read over it when it came in, and I can see some sense in it, but I do worry that perhaps we're gagging people that perhaps shouldn't be gagged. Some people should be entitled to say their views. I do think that if it's news, if it's current affairs, and they have this amazing expression in the email which almost had me laughing, factual journalism. I thought, goodness me, they're not suggesting there's journalism that's not factual. That they should certainly be bound by stringent rules. But I do think other presenters should have a bit more freedom to say what they think on issues. And I think, well, the example of Gary Lineker that kicked this off was what he said was perfectly correct, and proven to be so.
And I guess there would be a slight worry that these people they have a huge platform, so there's a big educational value to them engaging in politics. This could potentially have knock-on effects for their following, potentially disaffecting them from politics a little?
Well, I think it depends on how it's interpreted and just how stringently it's applied, because there are political issues that many people feel very passionate about that perhaps wouldn't be classed as party political. So I think that there's a real danger here that we're encroaching on genuine freedoms that we should be protecting, particularly for people who are just in a popular show rather than covering news and factual journalism.
Yeah, I guess especially would you say that there runs a risk of pushing the political discourse slightly further to the right because they're blocking the voices? So would you say that this potentially could have knock-on effects for the discourse in media and in politics in general?
I think it certainly could. I mean, there are many people in the broadcast entertainment world that I come into contact with, say, on issues of animal rights. Now, surely to goodness, them expressing those views does not cause anybody a problem. You know, if you disagree with them, you're not going to go, "Oh, that's outrageous that he said that." If you agree with them, you're going to say, "Oh, it's good. So and so believes the same as I do." But they do help move the debate on. So it's different if they're attacking political individuals, if they're showing a bias that's unfounded. But you know, I think we need to be very careful with of just how much we're restricting people's freedoms.
It's very much what's the line and who's drawing it.
Yeah.
So, next story of the night, the European Commission has warned European companies and governments that it could ban the sale of certain components to Turkey and other countries from where the parts are being resold to Iran and Russia for the use of drones and other weapons used to strike Ukrainian cities. The comments from the European Commission arise from a 47-page document in which the Ukrainian government detailed the use of Western technology and appealed for long-range missiles to attack drone production sites in Russia, Iran, and Syria. The Ukrainian paper submitted to the G7 governments in August claimed that there had been 600 raids on cities using unmanned aerial vehicles, UAVs, containing Western technology in the previous 3 months. 5 European companies, including a Polish subsidiary of a British multinational, were named as the original manufacturers of the identified components. The report does not suggest any wrongdoing by the Western companies whose parts were identified. Instead, the report said that Iranian UAV production has adapted and mostly uses off-the-shelf, commercially available components, the supply of which is poorly or not controlled at all. Customs information has shown that almost all of the imports to Iran originated from Turkey, India, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Vietnam, and Costa Rica. A European Commission spokesperson said evidence that components were being sourced via countries such showed that EU sanctions were creating significant pressures on their targets, but there needed to be a tougher enforcement by member states. The spokesperson called for keeping a closer eye on foreign operators that are re-exporting EU-sanctioned goods without the knowledge of the EU exporter, and called for the support of third-party countries' authorities to make sure that goods exported from the EU to those countries do not reach Russia. Among the European-made items found in Shahed 131 drones and 136 used by Russia in Ukraine were fuel pumps, transistors, power management circuits, and microprocessors. Vladimir Valasuk, a sanctions advisor working with the Office of Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, said the current situation regarding the drone components was frustrating and that lobbying efforts had been ongoing since June. So this is obviously a very complicated situation because there's so many international actors at play, and it's virtually impossible to keep abreast of everything. So what can be done, practically speaking, to prevent Western and European-made parts making it into Russian, Iranian hands?
Well, that's a very good question, and I'll be perfectly honest, I don't think I know the answer to that one. It's clear that the sanctions that have been in place are obviously working, and it's causing a logistical headache for their supply network. But clearly, stuff still getting to sites that are making drones, and Iran is one of those rogue states in the world that I think the UK should be taking a lot stronger action on in any case. So I think there is more that we need to be looking at. What can we do? And it needs to be international action if we're going to try and stop stop these trade routes, because clearly the firms, and I don't know if there's any firms in this country, but certainly the firms across Europe that are making these general components are not planning for them to be used in drones. So they're selling them in good faith to legitimate buyers, and then it's where they're going from there. So there's certainly a lot of work needing done, and I don't envy the people putting it together. But the fact that they've been able to trace this, they know the routes that they're taking. It certainly gives you enough evidence to start looking at what can you do to frustrate that supply route further.
And how important are international organisations? Obviously, the EU has sanctions, but could the UN come in and assist in this, or is it more down to a governmental basis?
I think in terms of realpolitik, we probably do require Europe and other governments to act together and act as quickly as they can to do whatever they can to, if not stop the trade of these parts, to at least slow down and hamper the trade of it. Anything that can be done quickly is the most important thing just now, I think, given the nature of the war that's ongoing. Don't wait for approval elsewhere. Act if you can would be what I would hope the attitude of governments would be.
Yeah. So we will move on to our next story. The president of the majority ethnic Armenian Nagorno-Karabakh region, Samvel Shaharamanyan, has signed a decree to dissolve all state institutions by the 1st of January 2024. Karabakh Armenian authorities have said in a statement. The republic would cease to exist from that day, a decree has said. More than half of the population of Nagorno-Karabakh has fled to Armenia in what the country has described as an ethnic cleansing after a 24-hour blitz last week by Azerbaijan to reclaim full control over the enclave. The decree also said that the local population must familiarize themselves with the conditions of reintegration presented by the Republic of Azerbaijan and make an independent and individual decision on whether to stay or leave the region. The assault by Azerbaijan's army forced local authorities to agree to lay down weapons and start talks on Nagorno-Karabakh's reintegration into Azerbaijan. Nagorno-Karabakh, which declared independence in 1991, was run by ethnic Armenian authorities for about 30 years. The spokesperson for the Armenian Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan said today that 68,386 people from Nagorno-Karabakh had crossed into the country, more than half of the 120,000 ethnic Armenians believed to be living in Karabakh before the latest round of fighting. Pashinyan warned in the coming days that no Armenians would remain in the region, calling the exodus an ethnic cleansing. Azerbaijani authorities have announced today that they have charged Nagorno-Karabakh's former leader Ruben Vardanyan with financing terrorism and other crimes. Vardanyan, who served as the state minister of the Nagorno-Karabakh Republic, was detained on Wednesday as he tried to cross the border into Armenia. Martyn, this is obviously a really upsetting story. In times of war and crisis, what is it that people at home can do? Is there to educate themselves or to donate to the ongoing crisis?
This is a very sad saga. I became aware with it about at the beginning of the year actually, and I was quite horrified by the stuff that was going on over the Lachlan corridor at the time, and I was shocked that our media, perhaps I shouldn't be surprised at this, just wasn't reporting the atrocities that had been happening in that region. Now the history and the legacy of this is that it's the Nagorno-Karabakh is an area that should by rights have been part of Armenia. But due to a historical twist of fate, when it was in the Soviet Empire, Stalin wrote the maps of the different Soviet states and he put it into Azerbaijan. And the legacy of troubles has happened pretty much ever since. And there's been several wars, there's been definite acts of genocide during those wars, and we're now witnessing ethnic cleansing. And it's a great tragedy that that very historic area has been lost to the ethnic Armenians whose home it is. And I hope that they get safe haven, and I'm sure that probably all of them will flee to Armenia as a result of what's happened. The history of that area is thoroughly depressing and appalling, and it's a sad indictment. I was calling at the beginning of the year that we needed international observers over there, and I still think that is the case to prevent ethnic cleansing from happening. It's just very, very sad.
It's awfully sad. And do you think that the UN, should they send in peacekeepers now, or do you think that this needed to happen 2 years ago when
it should have happened a long time ago, in my opinion. Obviously, in that area, the people tasked with keeping the peace and keeping at that time the corridor open, the Lachlan corridor, were the Russians, and I don't think they were doing a particularly great job on that for different reasons. So, it's a mess. It's a dreadful situation, and my heart really goes out to the Armenians in that area, and I think it's destabilizing for that part of the world. I mean, if we look at the countries around there, you've got Azerbaijan, you've got Iran, you've got Syria. The Armenians are probably the only genuine democracy in that area, and this was pretty much a satellite of their area. So, seeing them weakened in any way is concerning, and perhaps has larger global implications.
Yeah, hopefully the mainstream media will pick up on this story because it is so huge and it is so upsetting.
It is, yeah.
So our final story of the night, the Scottish Government has published the Just Transition Plan, is to publish the Just Transition Plan next year. A strategy to drive Scotland's fair and just transition away from fossil fuels will be published by next summer. Energy Minister Gillian Martyn announced the timeline as the consultation responses to draft energy strategy and just transition plan and independent analysis of those responses were published. The responses and continued engagement with a range of interested parties, including industry, the Just Transition Commission and Scottish Energy Advisory Board, will be informed the finalised strategy. Stressing the importance of reaching net zero in a way that spreads the benefit and costs of energy decarbonisation fairly, Ms Martyn reiterated calls for the UK government to do more to accelerate investment, reform markets and ensure benefits flow to communities. Ms Martyn said, "Delivering on our climate obligations with an unwavering commitment to a fair and just journey to net zero is an absolute priority for the Scottish Government." The consultation confirmed broad support for our vision and highlighted the importance of providing policy certainty to enable investment in skills, infrastructure and technologies. We will now publish our energy strategy and just transition plan by next summer, setting out how we intend to create a net zero energy system that delivers affordable, secure and clean energy whilst benefiting communities across Scotland by providing high quality jobs and economic opportunities. We believe that all future extraction of fossil fuels must be subject to strict climate compatibility and energy security tests. Our focus is on meeting our energy security needs, reducing emissions and delivering affordable energy supplies whilst ensuring a just transition for our oil and gas workforce as the North Sea resources decline. So in this plan that they're going to be publishing next year, Is this the kind of thing that you see the Scottish government doing from Westminster, from afar, and does it kind of spur you on a little bit?
Well, I think what I would say is it's very encouraging, and to have a timetable for it being published is great, and I look forward to reading it when it comes out. And it's not something I'm thinking of from afar, because I represent communities in West Lothian and the Falkirk areas, which had the legacy of mining, both coal and shale, and all the sort of job losses that went with those industries, and regeneration issues that happened in the communities. And what I don't want to see is something similar happening with, say, Grangemouth, for example, which has many downstream jobs from the oil and gas sector. So we need to make sure that we get the just transition, and that we get a low growth economy, a low carbon growth economy coming out of that. And I think that's really essential, that we get everything joined up and we learn the lessons from our history, so we don't make the mistakes of what happened before, when old industries, went into demise. So we've got to get this right, and if we get it right, we are secure for the future, both in terms of jobs and the economy, as well as saving the planet. What's not to like? It's got to be a positive.
What more could you want? So that's it for this evening. Thank you so much, Martyn. You've been a fabulous guest. I hope you've enjoyed your time on the show.
Yep, lovely meeting you.
Lovely to meet you too. So before I go, I just wanted to remind you that here at Broadcasting Scotland, we depend on the generosity of you, our viewers, our supporters. So to everyone who's donated and to everyone who already makes regular monthly payments, thank you so much. Our programmes will, of course, always be free to view. However, if you can afford £5 a month, please consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter. Our need to reach our £30,000 target is still pressing. However, the generosity of everyone at home has given us a little bit more time. We've now raised over £18,000 and we are able to continue making programmes for the next few weeks, but our need to raise the remaining £12,000 is still really urgent. So, thank you so much for watching. I'm Saoirse Healey. Good night.
Hello and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. My name is Lewis McGlynn.
Hello and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. My name is Saoirse Healey.
Hello and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. My name is Donald C. Stewart. Broadcasting Scotland is Scotland's independent broadcaster, providing factual news, reporting on the issues important to the people of Scotland.
We are committed to public service broadcasting, and with your support, we will produce even more programmes.
Provide opportunities for young people interested in media production and broadcasting, and challenge preconceptions of what Scottish media looks like, amplifying Scotland's voice and reflecting its communities.
We can already deliver high-quality live news, and we will create the highest quality programmes for you to enjoy. But we can only do that with your support.
So please subscribe to and share our channel or donate to Broadcasting Scotland via the link in the description. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.